Well, if you're still with me, you guys are the real troopers. I apologize for that. Hope it's worth it. Hope you have nothing else to do on your Thursday, whatever day it is. Okay. What I meant to do here is just share the screen. Here we go, without sound, because I had an audio clip I was going to play for you, and that was the problem, I believe. Okay, great. There we go. All right, so these black swan events, okay? So 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, these events have created a situation where people sometimes, if you look at the 9/11 report, for example, they talked about a lack of imagination. Okay, that's kind of throughout the document, that we didn't think about planes hitting skyscrapers. Well, we did think about it. We just didn't think it was a probable enough scenario that we really needed to put resources towards mitigating it. Okay. So what emergency planners do is they look at what's called the maximum of maximum scenario, meaning what is the worst thing that could actually happen in this situation? And if we train for that, and if we prepare for that worst situation, then anything else that is lesser, to a lesser degree, less intense, less consequence, we're going to be prepared for it. Okay, so it's thinking outside of the box. So as I'm kind of going through this thought process, I realized, well, we have these maximum scenarios, and recently with COVID-19, which is still ongoing, we saw unprecedented kind of like global implications. Now, it's not like nobody prepared for a pandemic, but what ended up happening is we got a quick lesson in how integrated the globe is with products, supply chains, with our economies tied together, anything from microchips to toilet paper that we couldn't get. And then we had these reality shifts. Okay, so if you think about an existential crisis, by that I mean something that threatens your existence. Okay, both your physical existence. We could talk about maybe an asteroid, right? And there's been a lot of warnings and things coming out. You know, this one's coming close to Earth. NASA's sending up, you know, rockets to try and stop, you know, redirect maybe an asteroid that's coming towards us. And so there is an element of a physical extinction, you could say, in an existential crisis. However, there's also something I think that is primarily psychologically based. So in other words, you might call it a psychological crisis within just the individual, but also collectively. Okay, so I think what we saw in COVID-19 is a taste, just a little bit of a taste of the collective crisis, a psychological thing. Okay, the reality shifts, anything from people you had to adapt to a new reality of wearing masks and social distancing. Our kids weren't able to go to school. You know, there's social problems of suicide, domestic violence. The research hasn't even begun to really get to the root and to dig into the implications of what has happened through COVID. Okay, so that's kind of my line of thinking, and what else might happen where we have one of these reality shifts. Okay, so I conceptualized something that I call a reality compromising event. So you're going to hear me say, I'll call it an RCE, and for short. What it really is it's an unknown unknown. Okay, so we sometimes, like say in a hurricane, you don't know exactly where the thing's going to land, how intense it's going to be, but we know hurricanes, right? One of the worst things that could happen in a war or disaster is you don't even know the questions to ask. You don't even know the factors that might be involved in it. That's what we mean by an unknown unknown. All right, so evaluating the theories on contemporary panic, human behavior in crisis, that's where I began, is looking at, well, what do the researchers, the scientists say? When people are in crisis, what do they do? Right? Do they panic? Do they normally, run around and react selfishly and panic buying or violence and rioting? Or is it rational behavior? What do the contemporary theories say about it? And I started with that because I believe that, as you'll see here towards the end, that we need to start reevaluating perhaps this unique type of novel crisis, okay, which I call a reality compromising event. There's something different. There's something different about that when it affects your reality, meaning that the shifts and the transformations versus just something that's maybe a purely physical, hazard causing agent. So then I get into exploring this hypothetical situation, and I hope you enjoy it because I carry it out to the full extent here. And exploring areas of resilience building, we call it in the industry. It's pretty dry stuff, but what can we do to build up both individual resilience, meaning your capability to handle a crisis, and also society? Is there anything we can do to prepare? Okay, so we'll talk about how bad can it get, and then is there anything that we can do? So reality compromising event, as I've defined it, is a globally experienced existential event characterized predominantly by a unique psychological component with the potential to produce significant reality transformations that threaten the human psyche. Okay, so this crisis starts from the inside. It's something that each person individually battles with, but when it leaks out, when it externalizes, it could cause the breakdown of institutions, physical infrastructure, and ordered and rational human behavior. So it does have an external impact, and that is the danger. That is where it's not just somebody who breaks down. We say break down a lot, right? We say they had a snap, a mental snap or something. They had to go maybe for a psychological evaluation to a hospital. That's what can happen to an individual. But when it happens as a society at large, as you'll see here, very, very substantial things can happen and not so much in a very short amount of time. So let's give you some examples. And these come from Professor Bader, who helped me. He was my advisor. He's at Chapman University. He threw out a couple of these examples, and I'm like, that's pretty good. Do you mind if I use that? So one of them, you have here the Back to the Future, right? So imagine in Back to the Future, if you tomorrow learned that we have the ability to time travel, okay? And so we could go back and fix past mistakes. We could go forward and change the outcome of things. Obviously, that would blow everybody's minds, right? Think about how we're so grounded right now in the present, and that's not even, well, some people claim they've time traveled, but that's not even something that fits our paradigm. Okay, another one would be, imagine if we could upload our consciousness. So you have, they're getting very close to this actually. In fact, Neuralink and Elon Musk have talked about the ability to, right now, I think research is focused on dreams. So kind of coding what your brain is seeing in a dream. So if we can code the data in your head, download it, and then re-upload it into an AI or a biological clone, which they're getting close to doing, it's kind of scary. Create a second you, all right? Imagine what that would do to people's realities. Okay, you've got your consciousness living through some machine or something else that's been created. Another one, this one's kind of fun. What if we're able to learn how to communicate and talk with animals? Okay, and put on, like a helmet like Dr. Dolittle or something, and talk to the animals, or you're able to maybe read somebody's thoughts. Okay, another reality shift. Now, these are quite extreme, but you can also just go into beliefs that are shared by a great number of people, including religious beliefs. You talk about the rapture. Now, I'm a religious person. Each religion has a different interpretation of things such as the rapture, but some believe that it is a physical event where people will actually be taken up into the sky to meet the Savior when he returns. And so, think about it. I'm not trying to be facetious here, but if you're sitting in class one day and you look around and all of a sudden half of your classroom just disappears, right? It gets taken up. Okay. So the rest of us who are left here are looking around and thinking, okay, that just blew my mind. Now what? Okay. So one interesting thing about all these hypotheticals too is that not all of them or any of them actually have to occur in reality if enough people believe that they're occurring. So what I mean is, let's say, I don't know, with AI consciousness, if enough people that came out and they said, hey, we've found that robots are sentient. Now, if that's not even the case, if they don't have feelings, but the guy over at Google that got fired or put on leave because he said he believed that the AI they created had feelings, if enough people believe that, it's the belief and the reality shift that occurs that actually causes the shift I'm talking about. Okay, so yeah, if any of these things happened, obviously it creates the reality shift. But the compromising event is the belief, the perception that it's occurring. Okay, so let's get on here. I did make this little animation. Giving an academic lecture, I was like, oh, I shouldn't joke around too much, but oh well. I've given this little animation before. Okay, so imagine our government or extraterrestrial beings themselves make an announcement. Okay, or they provide evidence that we're not alone in the universe. So tomorrow morning, this happens. Okay, little guy comes out. He's wearing a Georgetown shirt. That's so nice of him to represent. Comes out and gives a press conference, and they allow us to go inside the ship and film it, put it on the 10 o'clock news. Okay, so this type of event, no matter how it happens, okay, if it happens like overnight, the White House makes a press conference, or it comes out little by little, we'll talk about the difference and what might happen in each version of that iteration. But before we get into it, we need to set some boundaries. Okay, the first thing being, as you're doing academic research, especially, we can't assume that or try to convince someone that ET existence is real. I mean, that's not the point of this at all. Okay, so I don't focus on trying to establish the existence of it. Secondly, we have to presuppose that there's not a credible risk in this scenario of us being annihilated. Okay, so if that were the case, like an asteroid, and I said, okay, one's going to come down, NASA just told us you got 24 hours. 24 hours, we're going to be annihilated. Now, that would be interesting to study, wouldn't it? I mean, what we're going to do with our last 24 hours and how society is going to react. But it's kind of pointless if we're all going to be, wiped off the earth. There's no real point in studying this. So we're going to assume that the contact is at least neutral, that there's no hostile activity. Okay, so for our purposes here. Also, you're hearing me say ET scenario, alien contact, disclosure event. We're all talking about the same thing. Okay, that is extraterrestrials making themselves manifest, or we disclosing that we have had contact. So simply put, we're going to be using ET contact as a useful vehicle, okay, for evaluating the worst case scenario of an RCE. Again, reality compromising event is what I've named this. And every now and then we take a Mountain Dew break. It's to honor Brandon Fugel and I, big consumers of Diet Mountain Dew. All right. So here's the overarching hypotheses that I presented. I believe that RCEs are a primary hazard-causing agent, okay, that can trigger a unique class of novel-related crises, okay? Our current understanding of how risk might be interpreted and amplified in an RCE, I think, has been misapplied. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. It's not that I'm saying the theorists I'm going to show you were wrong. I'm just saying that I think they underestimated and tried to apply this to what we call a all hazards perspective, meaning in an earthquake, in a terrorism event, in a fire, in a movie theater, they tend to approach their research regarding panic in the same way. And I'm saying, generally, I think that might be true, but in this case, we have something that is very psychologically intensive, and it's different. So contemporary theories do predict that human behavior during crises, they don't sufficiently account for the psychological aspects of it. And I think it could overwhelm people's ability to adapt. Okay, and I'm only briefly going to go over the research. It's noted. If you do want my references, I had over, gosh, I don't know, 100 citations of journals and things that I went through to get a really good, comprehensive summary of what the contemporary research says. But my end kind of take home, as you'll see here, is that in an event such as ET contact, I think if it occurred, humankind could potentially face an unprecedented global catastrophe. And part of this, a lot of it is exacerbated by us not being prepared at all. Okay, so here's the research. This is what we call literature review. It takes up about 20 pages of my paper. At any rate, we start out, here's some of the key theorists. If you want to look this up, Slavic et al., they did a lot of research on risk perception. Okay, so they use what's called a psychometric paradigm, which is basically, they look at people's attitudes about particular risks, okay, and how they affect how they perceive how dangerous it is. It's quite interesting because they used nuclear energy, for example, nuclear power. When it was first introduced, and still is, most people fear it. They fear nuclear power plants like nothing else, right? They fear that it's going to have a meltdown. We don't understand it. We can't control it. In reality, it's the safest, cleanest energy. It really is. I mean, we've only had a handful of scares actually with nuclear power, either leaking or being maliciously destroyed, compared to all other forms of energy production. So what Slavic did is they created a sort of a matrix. Okay, so if you have a scale, a continuum, one of the scales measured what they called the dread risk. Okay, a factor that where people felt they had no control over hazard, and it had the most potential for deadly catastrophes. Okay, the other scale they did was the unknown risk factor. So they found that risk perception is most intense for hazards that were new, not clearly observed, and unknown. Okay, and where we had delayed evidence of the hazard, it was delayed, or the danger information was delayed. They use the example of microwaves. When microwave ovens were first invented, there was a lot of people who were afraid of them, okay, because there wasn't a whole lot of science. Okay, how is this nuking my hamburger, right? And so it's the unknown about the hazard that creates that risk. Second, social amplification of risk. This is one of my favorite theories, and this was primarily introduced by Casperson et al. And Starr is another theorist here. What it is it's timely for our day because it talks about how different factors of social media and what we call informal channels. Okay, so you have your formal channels, which would be the authority figures, the government, In the case of COVID, let's talk about that. The CDC, the WHO, you have Fauci, who was the key spokesperson, the authority figure who is giving us information about the pandemic, okay? Along with that, you have informal channels. So your informal channels are going to be your family. It's going to be your friends, your social media, the news, okay? Because all of these channels have, if you can imagine this model being the transmitter and a receiver. Within that, if you're transmitting a message you want the people to know, you have all these filters, okay? So the filters distort. They'll take that message, they'll either add to it or take away from it. And so what the receiver gets is not the pure unadulterated message. So what social amplification theory says is that the way the message is presented, how frequently, how strong, through how many channels, the trust that you place in those transmitting agents, that depends on how it gets amplified. So you can have something, case in point, just this morning I read in the newspaper, or the newspaper, I don't read the newspaper, the online, there was an alert sent out through all of Los Angeles telling people the whole city needed to be evacuated. Okay. That was a big problem, and it was a mistake. They don't know how the alerting system did that, but there is a fire going on in northern LA County, and somehow they were trying to get something out to news media, and it went out and broadcast everywhere that everyone needed to evacuate. Okay, so how do people take that message? It depends on who's giving the message and the informal channels. Like you'd go to your friends, or you would go to your family and say, do you think this is real? I mean, they're telling us all to evacuate. You look outside, like, well, I don't see any smoke. I don't see anything happening. Should we go? So you're trying to gather information, and more in our day, the informal channels are becoming actually more important in many cases than the formal channels. And we saw that in COVID. We saw that. A really big example of it being that half of the people or more distrusted the government message because, and don't get me wrong here, I do not want to get political here, because on both sides, both political spectrums, doesn't matter who was president, their administration made some major mistakes in the transmitting of the message. Okay, because one day we're told that we don't need to wear masks at all. The next couple weeks it might help. First it didn't help, and then it might help, and then we double and triple mask, and then kids need masks and kids don't need masks. We're very grateful that we got the immunizations. The vaccines came out. Warp speed came out super fast, but we were told they're this effective, and then, oh, they're not as effective. You need a double, a triple booster. You need this and that. Okay. The problem is not that science is imperfect. That's not the problem. The problem was the messaging of telling people we are sure, and this is what you need to do, and don't ask questions. Okay. And heaven forbid anybody have a different opinion. The messaging broke down. And so you have this distrust by a number of people who say, why should I believe you next time? Okay, if you're going to come out and tell me it's this way or that, just be honest with me and say, we don't know right now. There are things we don't know. It's a developing thing. Okay, and so, like I said, both political, right and left, they both did it, and they both have agendas that they use this. And all disasters, I heard this throughout my whole program, all disasters are political. Okay, we're not going to get into politics here, but realize that there's a lot of study done on risk communication and the amplification of it. Socially distributed cognition. So this, one of my favorite books, I believe it's behind me back here. This is using those informal channels as well in something that I believe the book I'm trying to reference is Blink, I think it is. Burst also kind of gets into it, but at any rate, the taking kind of snippets of information from our informal channels and taking that information. People nowadays are browsers or grazers, I should say, of info. They rarely will read a whole article. They rarely get into it and do their own research. So as I said, as we're becoming more reliant on the informal channels, it's more important that we have some ability to control what's coming through that. And by control, I don't mean censor. I just mean it's got to be managed and the messaging has to be correct. Same thing with the compliance to the warning messages. So there's some theorists there who will talk about in compliance and when people receive a message, do they go get vaccinated? Do they wear their mask? Do they social distance? Why or why not? Okay, so that's kind of really going to come into play here when we talk about ET contact. Finally, the bulk of the idea, okay, of the research of the idea that people are going to panic or not is based on, if we go back, I would say you can find evidence of it way back in the 50s, even the 40s, as I show you some stuff. But the main theorist here is Quarantelli and Lindell, Erickson. They all talk about human behavior in a disaster, and overwhelmingly, the research says that most people are orderly and rational. They don't become selfish. In fact, they come together to help each other. They don't panic. Okay, now one problem is we've got to define what panic is, as I'll show you here in a minute, because it's kind of a broad term. But the other thing is, as we look into this, as I got into it, I found that most of their research was really based on natural disasters. And it was based on things that are what we call sudden onset. So you have a fire in a movie theater, okay? Most people don't trample each other trying to get out. You know, we saw that 9/11. It was harder for people to get moving. Okay, when they saw that their tower, they're working and was struck, they gathered their things. They went around and got their purse, got their phone, called their family. What should I do? Made their way down slowly. There's this milling about stage, and it's not generally panic. Okay, now keep that in mind, because I'm going to present a kind of an antithetical situation to that. Finally, I did look at some gray research, which we call gray research, government reports, crime statistics, things like that. All right, let's get into the fun stuff. Okay. Because I do have limited time here. I've only got probably another half an hour or so, and I want to get through most of this. Give you a little bit of background for those who are not as nerdy as I am when it comes to the ET scenario, okay? Historically, walk through time with me for a minute. What happened in the 40s and 50s, we had an explosion of UFO reports. Okay, we call them UAPs now. But the first kind of real media attention began in 1947 when a pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported seeing a formation of saucer-shaped objects. I don't know if he actually used the word saucer, but near Mount Rainier as he's flying. So this makes the newspaper, and that whole summer we have, especially in the Southwest, a ton of reports. You can go back to the newspapers and see. The culminating event that we're most familiar with was July, in the first week of 47, where the Army Air Force announced capturing a flying disc in Roswell, New Mexico. So we could spend a whole lot of time on that. But again, the point of this paper is not to convince anyone of ET existence. It's just to tell you the backstory here. 1952, over 2 weekends, dozens of UFOs actually buzzed over the US Capitol and the White House. Okay, some of these were tracked over 7,000 miles an hour. And there's some great books out there that detail Project Blue Book's involvement, which was just starting, after named Project Blue Book. And the actual evidence, the radar, evidence and everything that actually took place there. So at this point, the government starts to get really concerned. Okay, they're more concerned about the national security and panic without really saying or believing perhaps that this is extraterrestrial. The CIA is more concerned that the UFO reports would strain their intelligence efforts. So if we have a ton of UFO reports and we're during the Cold War, Russia decides to sneak in and to actually fly in covertly and do surveillance or drop bombs, they're worried that we're not going to be paying attention to that because we're too busy chasing down UFO reports. So what they did is they sponsored a panel. It came to be known as the Robertson panel. Okay. And they had got a picture of them here. There you go. They had a number of notable scientists and researchers get together, and they reviewed some UFO films, assessed the situation. Their conclusion, to cut to the chase here, was that they thought there's a great potential for triggering mass hysteria and panic. Okay, mass hysteria and panic. So, what was that based on? So, as you get into it, if you want to, it's available. You can go and find that report, and they don't really cite anything academic except for a study that was done by Cantrill. Okay, now Cantrill, we'll get into that in a minute because it's really it's a fun study. But it looked at the War of the Worlds radio show that happened in 1943, I think it was 42 or 43. No, 38. I'm sorry. And they looked at the study, and they heard all these reports that people panicked, they freaked out, they ran into the streets. And so they're thinking, if we now had information and we release this, we think that that's what's going to happen in the 50s. So they actually recommended starting an educational program. Okay, no joke, using psychologists and advertising experts to try and remove the stigma that UFOs had obtained. One side note, and yes, thank you, I see in the comments, it was Orson Welles, the radio program we'll get into in a minute. One side note here is that Walt Disney was named as somebody that could help in the campaign, okay, to further the debunking policy. And they did create, that's a whole other tangent we could go on. The government allegedly approached him. There's stories where the Air Force approached Disney and had meetings, told him they were going to give him some real UFO footage, whether that was aliens or craft or whatnot, and they wanted him to make a documentary on it. And anyways, so based on these policy decisions, you now see this implemented into the government's policy on UFO reporting of ridicule, denial, not taking the report seriously, and trying to dampen the intensity surrounding it. And that's not argued. People who look into it, we now know that was the policy in place. It's actually written in policy manuals as to what they should do when they receive a report. Now, the War of the Worlds study by Cantrill was really cool, but it received a lot of criticism because it was mostly anecdotal, right? They would go back and say, well, people panicked. Of the 6 million people who heard this, I'm getting ahead of myself, I guess. This was the night before Halloween. And so it was October 30th of 1938. Remember, most people are getting their news from the radio. So most people believed anything that came out of the radio was the truth. There's no need to question it. And they took a play, turned it into a radio play. I'm sorry, book, turned it into a radio play. And if you tuned in at the beginning of it, they clearly say this is a play, a dramatic presentation presented by CBS. And then they made another pause during the thing. And at the end, it's obviously a radio show. Okay. But people who tuned in between it heard that there was an alien invasion happening. Now I do have some audio here. What I'm going to do, because when I click share, apparently it goes into a loop, guys, and then nobody's happy. So let me see if I can turn my speakers up and see if you can hear it. Nope, apparently not. I had to turn my audio down. It's going to loop. Okay. So sad, because it's actually pretty cool, and you can hear the actual broadcast. But if anyone wants it, I'll make it available at some other point. You can actually just go on YouTube and you can hear the whole thing. It's about an hour long, and I only had a snippet here. In the interest of time, what happens then is Project Blue Book's created. Okay, it went from about 1952 to 69, and they closed Blue Book in 69 based on basically what was known as the Condon report, where they looked at it and they said, well, we couldn't find anything that significantly suggests that we have a national security threat. They did have 701, unidentified or unexplained cases, but it's not worth spending the government's money in, as their report. And so suddenly, they closed down Blue Book, and officially, that's the last that the government investigates UFOs for decades. Okay, and if you're following this story, we now know that is not true. Skipping ahead here into 61, there was another report done by the Brookings Institution. This is also fascinating, but it only really mentions extraterrestrial contact in about, I found maybe 5 pages or so of the report. It was presented to Congress, and it looked ahead only 20 years. Okay, so it said, if we continue in space exploration, if we find existence of ET life in 20 years, what should we do? Okay, they really believed we were going to find it within 20 years. We were using radio telescopes. Okay, we're introduced and we're listening now to the stars. And they again cited Cantrill's study, and they had concerns that society was going to disintegrate. Okay, now they weren't so black and white as the Robertson panel. In fact, they did mention the possibility of ET contact bringing us together. Okay, we call this the unification kind of a theory. You may have heard Ronald Reagan talk about it. Bill Clinton has talked about it. Maybe Obama has even made a comment about it. But the idea is, we're so divided in our country and the world between borders. If we had a threat such as ET contact, and we're so worried about what are they doing, who are they, then we're going to work together as humanity, and it's actually going to bring us together. Okay, so we're not going to divide into chaos. That's the theory. So they present both of these, but at the end of the day, the Brookings Institution says we should probably look at situations where highly technically advanced societies have met others who are not. So Columbus, the Westerners, coming to America. And they said in every instance, it hasn't turned out well for the less technologically advanced society. So they too said that the outcome could vary greatly among different cultures, religion, and social demographics. Okay, so they're worried. They pretty much keep the policy in place. They talked about we should have a plan of what to tell the public. Okay, so they're thinking about it. They're actually thinking about it. But what they come up with, take a little break here for some. This is not my Mountain Dew. This is actually a powdered energy drink. So I kind of switch between the two every day. I'm trying to wean myself off the Mountain Dew, everyone. Okay. So the Torino scale is introduced. Okay, this was adopted in 1999. If you listen to the NASA reports of an asteroid, coming close to Earth, this is how they evaluate it. They basically look at the probability it will collide with us, and then they also look at the factors of, they tried to measure not just the physical, but the social impacts. But within the scale, there's no ability to do that, really. The probability versus the energy that how big that rock is it's going to hit us gives you an intensity level of 1 to 10. Okay, but what do you do with that number, right? There was no research that says a 5 means people are going to be able to deal with it. A 10 means they're going to freak out. There's no research backing that up. So it's inadequate, obviously, for what we're trying to do. So what SETI, the Search for Intelligence, for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, they adopted a scale that came along later in 2003 called the Rio scale. Now, I don't mean to denigrate SETI. It's a start. I love SETI. I love what they're doing there. And I've talked to some people over there. They've modified this over the years, but basically the Rio scale is meant to do what we call a THIRA, threat, hazard, and risk assessment on ET contact. So it takes the probability that, okay, let's say we receive a message. Okay, so you can see here in the matrix, it looks at the type of message received. Okay, did we get a specific message addressed to Earth? Or was it just that we got signals that, a planet might be engineering, what do they call that? Terraforming, or, doing something to their planet, to make it livable or whatever. What signal did we get? And then was it consistent, continuous, or was it a one-time thing so we can't go back and repeat it? And then how far away is it? And then who was telling us about this discovery? How reliable is it? Okay, were there multiple scientists who could chime in and peer review the signal? So if you multiply all these things together, again, it comes up with a scale of 1 to 10. All right. So the critiques, of course, is that these values are arbitrary. Who is to say that a 6 is, compared to a 1, receiving an Earth-specific message is that much more serious or less serious than in just getting a signal from something that's omnidirectional and it's not meant for Earth? Who's to say that we're going to freak out a whole lot more if it's within our solar system versus 40 light years away? The point is, I think it's a great start, but it's not based on measurable, quantifiable statistics, okay, that we can say that this represents what we know about human behavior. The biggest problem, if I were giving this presentation live, I am live, but asking you, would be, what's missing here? What's the major assumption? And the answer is that they're studying radio signals, okay, things that come from inside the solar system, or that we're going to pick up by radio or some other measuring device. Nowhere in the Rio scale does it account for the possibility that extraterrestrials may have already visited, that they may actually be here. It's very different if we send a probe out to Mars and we find bacterial life. It's almost laughable to try and compare that to the reaction, in my opinion, the reaction the public would have if you told them extraterrestrials have been visiting us since 1947 and they're here now. Oh, look, bring one up to the podium. Let's talk to him. It's not even in the realm of the same world. Okay, when you're talking about the variety of ways that a signal or that information could be disclosed. Okay, if that makes sense. So bottom line is, our risk assessment tools for evaluating this threat are very inadequate. I'm happy that people have tried. They need to be improved upon, but the big question is, how do you do that? Right? Because it's an unknown. How do you, gauge how people might react when we don't have a real life situation to approximate it? Okay. So we really just don't have anything that is similar to be able to say, well, it's probably going to be like the time the asteroid nearly hit us and we all ran outside and freaked out. We've never had an asteroid come that close to Earth. Okay, the government to tell us it's going to happen, and so we've never been able to measure it as such. Okay, I just got a notification there might be a problem with the feed. Are you guys still getting it? Let me just pull this up really quick. I still see it showing. Yep, and I still see me live. So okay, we'll just keep going. I didn't see people's comments. They kind of disappeared, so I don't know what happened there. Okay. All right. So moving on. Now we're in 2017. New York Times does a story, and the DoD has now officially admitted that. Yep. Okay, we're still good. DoD has officially admitted that they had a program. It wasn't classified, but parts of it were. It wasn't. I should say a black project where no one should know about it. It was just very well hidden. Okay, where we spent at least $22 million from 2007 to 2012, and the point was to study the UAP phenomenon or phenomena. And a lot of that went to Robert Bigelow, okay, who owns Skinwalker Ranch. He has his own space company, Budget Motels, okay, this billionaire who spent a lot of money, and they gave him the bulk of the contract. And the videos and secretive program received unprecedented media attention because we have these famous videos that come forward known as the Tic Tac, the U.S. Nimitz case that happened, the Navy ship, and both on the east and the west, we have these Navy incursions of airspace, these thermal videos that come out. And so suddenly the media is taking notice, right? And a Gallup poll just happened a couple years ago says that now 68% of Americans believe the government knows more than they're telling us. Okay, so the public opinion, the perception is that there's a lot going on. The government doesn't even, first of all, the intrinsic disclosure here was that they had a UFO program. And they've been telling us all along they weren't studying UFOs. Okay, so it's really bad for the government or anyone else when you're caught in a lie, and then you're caught in another lie, and they say, well, yeah, we had a program and we still have a program. Okay, so Congress now directs the DoD to produce a report and says, okay, we want to know what's going on. You specifically need to tell us what you've been studying, what you know, and this happened last year. So the preliminary assessment comes out that they still have an active UAP task force, that they had in that report 133 of 144 cases were deemed unexplained. Okay, of these ones they were looking at. No evidence they were foreign, adversarial origin, or U.S. black projects. So they call it this other category. Okay, so what is the other? The big question is, are they seriously looking at it as possibly extraterrestrial, or they just put it in the other category and say, well, we don't know, don't worry about it, right? This led to a congressional hearing of May of 17 of this year, which was the first time since Project Blue Book was closed the government officially acknowledged the UAP situation as a potential national security threat. And for those of you who are up on this, you know all this stuff, but how historical is it that for the first time, we're looking at this? Now, some would argue, well, they do that, they call it national security because they need the funding. It's all about funding, right? Spend more money. I would disagree, because this is different when you have the other arm of the government, Congress, demanding and taking this seriously because their constituents and everyone who's seeing these videos and seeing objects and things happening with their own eyes want answers. And so we got this momentum going. Now, what's happened most recently is they're preparing for another round of hearings. I've been told it might be happening in January. the DoD has to produce a certain number of UAP reports quarterly and annually. And this information will be coming out, and I hope it doesn't lose momentum. Okay, but I'm getting off on a tangent because that's my desire. I'm specifically wanting to talk about what the potential here is. I'm not going to play this because this was just a summary of the day before the hearing and what we would expect might be coming forward. But we know that if I play it, it's going to get into the audio loop and drive everybody crazy. So I'm going to skip through it, kind of the interest of time too. But here's Deputy Director Scott Bray. He's the Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence, and he was one of those who provided testimony. And there he is at the screen. He was presented a couple of different videos, and just kind of interesting side note, he showed the Jeremy Corbell video of the pyramid, what's known as the pyramid UFO, USS Russell, I believe, of the drone swarming. I don't want to get into this, but I did take some night vision and was able to go out and replicate what we call the bokeh effect that caused some focusing problems, in my opinion, that made that look like a pyramid. However, I do not dismiss the importance of that whole event, because I think there's something very concerning there. If these are drones, meaning man-made, who owns them? You know, why do they have some of the abilities they do to fly into the water, to stay up in the air for over an hour and a half? All these things are answers that I think the government really needs to get to the bottom of and take seriously. But here he is saying that specific video, it's not the video that's up on the screen there. He pointed out, someone asked him, one of the congressmen, he's like, well, did you take night vision? Did you try that? Did you actually see what this so-called drone looks like in night vision? He says, no, but we're aware of other research that has done that. And that was me. There was somebody else who did it as well, but it's good to know that they are looking at some of the public, okay, for help. They've been mandated to actually look in public organizations, maybe MUFON, to try and gather data, because up until now, they've just been relying primarily on the Navy and what they've seen. Okay, I digress. So, timeline, if you look there at the bottom of your screen, we start all the way back from 1938 and how this is assessed as a not a national security threat, but they say people are going to panic, they're going to freak out. We have the flap of UFO activity in the 50s and 60s, the Robertson panel, the Brookings Institute, all of this for all these decades, okay, of the situation being treated as we're concerned. We don't know what to tell the public if this happens, but we don't have the tools to actually evaluate the threat. And it's not until recently in this past year that it's now deemed a potential national security threat. Okay, so with those tools being inadequate, my assessment was that they're using, at least publicly, there is no contingency plan. Now, I've actually spoken to people at FEMA. It wasn't official. I did ask for an official statement. I have not received. It was actually part of our filming. We contacted FEMA to see if there was a plan in place. They were helpful. I think they started to gather an answer for us, but never got back to us. There is no official contingency plan. I spoke to people there, and they pointed me towards, go to this policy manual, look at this, look at that, but there's nothing specific for extraterrestrials. Okay, there's some vague references of things. I don't have them here, but they actually, people know of the, there's a manual for firefighters. It's a FEMA handbook that has a chapter on what to do if you come across a crashed UFO. There's also an Air Force manual for the Air Force Academy that has a whole chapter talking about UFO contact. So there's discussion of it, but there's no actual plan in place. If there is, and that exists somewhere within the DoD. It is not known. So we get back to what we call this lack of imagination, okay? So in many ways, what's happened is the government has left it to the scientific community to come up with a plan. So here comes SETI, right? The Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. They created a post-detection task group, which basically what happens, there's a protocol if they receive a credible signal. Again, we're talking about radio signals, that they're supposed to include notifying the Secretary General of the United Nations. There's a treaty in place regarding that, in fact. And then the person making the discovery is encouraged to work with their authorities in their country. But you don't have any international law that requires it. So as much as we love to think that our scientists are level-headed, right, and they're going to do the right thing, there's nothing that requires that they sit on that information. They could take video, audio they captured, signals, whatever, and go straight to the news with it and broadcast that to the world without talking to anyone. It would be quite dumb of them to do that, but they're kind of self-regulating. So something fun that I did when I was filming, we went on one of our trips with the university, went to Puerto Rico. I stayed an extra day because I don't even know if it made it into the cut on UFO Witness, but I went to Arecibo, that big dish that they, I think it's in Contact. I don't know if it's in Contact. It's in one James Bond with Pierce Brosnan. I remember it's in the opening scene. It's in a number of movies. That huge dish, okay? It's back here, that thing. What happened to it is the middle element part of the array fell down, the cable snapped, and it broke. So SETI is pretty much broke too. They suffered major funding cuts. They're privately funded. The government doesn't fund them anymore. And so I went there on a Sunday, and I tried to go in to see if anyone could let me see the dish. There, if you look to the left, there's that little security guard station. I don't know if you can see if I put my cursor here. Right there. And I walked up, and the guy's like, I'm the only person there. And he's like, there's no scientists here on Sunday. There's no tours. And because of COVID, we haven't been open for months. And I was like, can I go see the dish? And he's like, no, I'm really sorry. There's just me here. So you can't get in there, and you can't hike around the perimeter because it's a super long hike. So I said, well, can I use your bathroom? So here's a picture of me. And that's as close as I got with a rental car here. I go into the bathroom, and I was about to go into the stall when I realized they're all out of toilet paper. Okay, there was no paper towels, there was no soap. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, crap, not literally. But I'm like, is this kind of the future of SETI? And is this a kind of a harbinger, a sign of the state of affairs of the scientific endeavor? Now, this doesn't have to do with my paper, and this is my personal opinion, but I do think this is very myopic of them to view looking at the stars only for evidence, right? So much money has been spent on these radio telescopes that the scientists are almost ashamed to say, well, you know, that's where the signal is going to come from. Why do we need to look here? Why do we need to look at the here and now, you know, here on Earth, and study these reports from credible people and footage and things like that? Because it's going to come from a radio signal, obviously. Okay, that's the thinking, right? So in the sense of emergency management, are we missing something really big? Going back to the lack of imagination, if we're only looking at the stars, does that throw off our ability to predict the real impact of what might happen? Okay, so have we ever experienced a real world full-fledged RCE? Well, COVID, the pandemic did run contrary to theories of human behavior in some parts, I believe. And I'll show you why I believe that. But is this just an outlier event? Is it a one-time thing, or do people still really react rationally? Generally I think they do, but what happened is this, right? We had reality shifts, like I said, of mask wearing, social distancing, telecommuting to work, quarantining. A lot of things happened. So we have sort of a microcosm experience of a full reality compromising event. We had a little taste of it. Okay. But because we don't have a full scale RCE, we have to look at some of the things that happened during, for example, COVID. One thing was we had increased crime. So, excuse me. A lot of studies indicate that this was because of domestic violence. So when people are quarantined, you had to spend all day with your family, and more violence happened because you're on each other's nerves and whatever. And some people in abusive relationships, increased crime, right? Well, murders, I don't have the stat here, do I? I don't think I do. There it is. So homicide rates increased nearly 49%, okay, when the pandemic began. Domestic violence is the only exception in emergencies where they say that is typically, like I said, expected to go up, but crime in general immediately goes down, according to the studies during a disaster. It's strange, but that's what they say. Now, people who providing an alternative explanation say that we had in the US a lot of violent protesting during the summer of 2020. We had the George Floyd killing. Was that 2021? It's all a blur to me. And the summer protesting and all of that was what caused the increase, is what they say. Well, then what I did is a cross-international study and looked at things where they didn't have protesting in other countries, and they therefore should not have such an increase. And they did have a decrease in many things, but basically it was inconclusive because they weren't measuring specifically domestic violence. Okay, so we really don't know. The jury's still out on that as to what caused violence to increase greatly in the US and in a lot of places in the world. Panic buying. Okay, so what's interesting about toilet paper, I interviewed an executive of Associated Foods. The logistics supply chain, the way that, let's just take toilet paper, for example. When it initially happened, there was no threat to the logistical supply chain. There wasn't for most items. Okay. But they had to kind of shift because people were using toilet paper more at home and not at work. Industrial toilet paper is different, and they market and package it differently. And so there is that shift that had to occur when they retooled and started creating more home consumer toilet paper versus work toilet paper. Okay, this is interesting to you, I don't know, but that happened later. Okay, that was, several months into it. Initially, though, you could still buy toilet paper. The problem was people would hear on the news that the shelves were empty, or they go to Costco and see that lady has like a shopping cart full of it. Maybe I should get some. Okay, and so the perception that it was going to be scarce, psychological crisis, created a chain reaction, and then there really was a crisis. Okay, and you're going to see here as I present to you the worst case scenario. It's not just toilet paper. We call these cascading effects. And to get to the crux of this, and I've got to wrap this up in about 10 minutes here. The crux of my whole research was that if things go bad, the cascading effects or the chain reactions is what's going to cause it. Okay, so if we take social amplification of risk, the theory I introduced before, and the factors in this research that intensify the risk, okay, as a catalyst to trigger this event, what you get is this map. Now, I made this up. It's very confusing if you look at it. Basically, we have the initial event is ET existence is revealed. all of the first level consequences, we call them, the pink ones, are first levels. Okay, so the first level consequence, these are all psychologically based. So, for example, extreme personal stress. Okay, people panic. There's panic among the vulnerable people, and because people have this personal stress, that line leads us to maybe panic buying, because they're going to go out and start buying food and necessities. Again, we don't have a physical threat yet. All we had was the government or somebody told us, hey, we've had contact with extraterrestrials. Okay, so you're feeling the personal panic. That leads to people not going to work. Okay, because your boss is not going to force you to come to work. He's going to say, he or she's going to tell you to stay home and take a couple weeks, be with your family and your loved ones. Well, what that causes is, if you follow this line down here, stockouts. That's when there's no, everything's not in supply at the store because there's nobody at the factory making it, right? That leads to construction, homes and business buildings not being built, housing shortages. That leads to medication and supplies being depleted. That leads to medical emergencies. That leads to the EMS being overwhelmed. So the green loops, the green arrows loop back to another level of consequence, because I didn't want to name, them more than once. And so as I present this to people, I say, does it look confusing to you and chaotic? Like you can't follow any of these lines? Good. Then it's done its job. That's exactly my point. Okay. The chaos that comes from one event that does not have to be physical does create what we call external first, second, third, fourth order consequences. Now, here's the scary bit. Okay. The majority of people do not have to participate in panic for this to happen. And by panic, I don't mean they run around with their head cut off, running around in the streets and saying we're all going to die. By panic, I mean just personal stress that causes you to take your money out of the bank. Okay, that causes the government to suspend elections. That causes, here's martial law. There's chaos and things in the street because all that needs to happen is a couple shootings, a couple violent things, mobs, and the news will take that. And do you think the news is going to present it in the light of, hey, here was one isolated event in another city that's not even in your state, one event, don't worry about it, people aren't panicking in droves? No. That will be played over and over ad nauseum on the news. Social amplification of risk now happens. And now you got your neighbors over here feeding you day by day. Okay, so remember, this is not like the Cantrill, the War of the Worlds radio broadcast. Okay, it's not one time a 1 hour radio broadcast and then they explain it was a play. People will know once the announcement is made because it's going to be over everywhere. Every radio station, TV, internet, social media, every world leader will be talking about it. Nobody's going to mistake it for a play. Okay, and so once that happens, then you have your informal channels, your family and everyone coming in, and you've got nothing to do. You're out of work, you're sitting at home, and all you do is you're an empty vessel for a lot of people, for the media to take their place in it and perpetuate the fear, the panic, the doomsday, anything that anyone wants to tell you. And the majority of people do not have to participate in it. If you hear that it's not safe to go shopping because there's looting happening in some part of the country, you don't go shopping. If you don't go to work, we saw what happened. You see all of these things on here? With the exception of martial law and complete infrastructure failure like telecommunications, power, that happened to some degree. But with those exceptions, every single one of these things already happened during COVID-19. Okay, so chew on that for a bit. I might have to step out just for a minute to tell my client coming in that he'll have to wait just a minute. I'll check on that in just a second. I call this the potential perfect storm of events, because what happens if you take Casperson and their factors and attributes of warning messages and combine it with Fishkoff, et al., and dread risk factor, getting into the nuts and bolts. If you combine all those things, I made a short list here. The volume of the message, meaning how loud is it? You know, how often are they telling us about the ET contact news? Is it disputed? Oh, you better hope it. I mean, you better expect it will be disputed. Where have the experts been? The experts in COVID are supposedly our medical experts. Where are the experts in UFOs? Okay, I don't like it when people refer to me as an expert, because how do you become an expert in something that's not known? It's best guessing. Okay, so the news is looking for people to talk to who are experts, and when the people don't get the information they need from them, they're going to go back to their government and say, well, you tell us. And what happens? You go back to the government, and the government has two options. Okay, they either say, well, we've been lying to you and we've known all along, which is not a comforting message. Or they say, we know as much as you do, not another comforting message. Okay, so it will be disputed. It will be dramatized. We know that the media will take it and run with it 24/7. The meaning contained in the message, are we supposed to panic or not? That's going to be disputed. There's more studies on voluntariness, meaning if people are less concerned about a hazard if they voluntarily can participate in it. Do you have a choice? If ET contact is here, do you really have a choice, okay, to participate or not? And then the person's ability to influence or control the hazard, right? So let's just suppose that abduction scenarios are real, okay? And just say that maybe some people have been abducted. My series UFO Witness really does dramatize and get into the scary parts of what people say they've experienced. Now, imagine if the government says any part of that might be true, okay? The voluntariness of participating in an abduction scenario where you have no control, you didn't choose to do it, even if it's not true, the idea that it's giving credence to these accounts is going to cause, in my opinion, a mass hysteria to some people in the whole idea of contact now with these race of beings. Okay, so you can't influence it, you can't control it. Do you know much about it? Nope, we don't. How much is it feared? We could get into Hollywood. We could talk about, and I do appreciate the irony in this. Hold on one second here. Yep. Give me 1 second, guys. It'll be just 5 minutes. 2 minutes. Yeah, bring your box space, and that's all you'll do. Okay, sorry about that. This is so not professional. Okay, so we'll wrap this up in 10 minutes here. So how much is the hazard feared? And I say, you know, I do appreciate the irony that here I am, a TV show host, and a lot of the stories we present are very fearful. I've always said there is another side to that. There's benevolent contact, but I'm not usually a producer at all in anything that I participate in. And I will say that, you know, TV shows need ratings as entertainment to be able to tune people in, and there is an imbalance. Okay, I'm not speaking for any particular, you know, network or anything, but there's an imbalance, I think, with showing the scary things. Okay, and the question then is, does Hollywood have a duty to balance that out? Okay, should they or can they? And if you take a look at, I don't have it on here. Actually, I do. It's coming up, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But that's one question to ask. Okay, and the potential, the hazard will end in catastrophe. So that's kind of a given. I just, showed the cascading maps thing. The potential that this could go very wrong is a very salient point in all of this. So my kind of conclusion on this, or the question to ask is, could ET contact be the perfect storm of high stakes risk perception? Okay, and the short answer to it is, it depends. It depends. Okay, so I could have just ended my research at that and said, I pointed out the problems with evaluating the risk. I pointed out how an RCE could take place, but I kept writing and I kept studying, and that 50-page paper turned into 92 pages because I felt like I had so much to say about the solution, if there is a solution. Okay, and I didn't want to leave it as it depends. Well, what does it depend on? Do we have any control over this whatsoever? So what I came up with is what I call the trifecta of RCE stability. If you take a stool and a three-legged stool, and let's say it's pretty lightweight, okay? The reality shift or the psychological crises, okay, the things that are coming from that ET disclosure, okay? That threat is like a wind. And if you have a really light stool, that stool could topple over easily if the wind is strong enough, okay, that reality shift. But strangely enough, if we actually put weight on top of the stool, and this being the external threat, it adds pressure to us, yeah, but we can account for some of that unification theory, perhaps. So maybe it stabilizes us a little bit, the external threat, because we'll come together, okay? And maybe that's not such a bad thing, but that is predicated first on the integrity of the legs of the stool, okay? So if you look here, we have the nature of the revelation, okay? So that is how the content from the government or whoever, what is actually told to us, how fast does it come out, and the intensity of it. So we could do this one of two ways. We could actually have, like I call it, the rip off the Band-Aid approach. The White House could tell us one day over a weekend, and they could say everything they know, and rip off the Band-Aid as quick as you can and just get it over with. Or you could have something we call the drip method, which is releasing information slowly over time. Okay, and again, this is really untested. It's only theory to know which of these things is going to work better or worse. But if you look at the theories of the intensity of it, my opinion is the all in one day is not going to go over well. The speed and intensity of it could cause that leg to fail. The capability of the crisis planners. So the government in this situation is really kind of the main agent of the crisis planning. They have to stay ahead of the news, right? They've got to manage the threat perception and maintain trust for the people. And that's why I said they've already started at a huge disadvantage here, because they're caught, and I mean it with due respect, but they've already been caught in a lie, many lies, right? They've been telling us all along that they haven't had programs to study UFOs, but they have. And now they've got to tell us whether they know more than they're telling us or that they don't know anything. And neither one of those things are going to help. And then finally, we have the resilience of mankind. Okay, so we have vulnerable populations of people. The Cantrell study talked about gullible people, and they actually kind of profiled them. What makes a gullible person? Well, basically it's your person who doesn't use critical thinking skills. Somebody who hears a rumor and boom, they believe it, and they use confirmational bias. Like War of the Worlds, these people looked outside and they said, well, I didn't see anyone panicking, but I thought maybe they've already evacuated. Maybe the cars are already gone. So they took information and made it fit their paradigm without actually researching it, right? And that, I'm afraid, there is a segment of population who are very vulnerable to that. Preparation for the crisis and in coping with the after effects. So how resilient are people to adapt? Okay, any one of these legs could fail. Boom. What happens is our stool falls over, and the reality shift then comes along with the winds and just scatters everything. Okay, so yes, I am talking worst case doom scenario here. So we've got to have all these legs in place. Well, is there anything we can do, right? Studies have shown that people don't do well with uncertainty and a disaster if they have no prior experience with it. Well, I mean, that seems common sense, but how do you become familiar with a hazard, right? Here you have a car crash, and they did studies, and it's like, well, in a car crash, if you get in a really bad one, you actually, a lot of people are more scared of the next car crash. It didn't actually help them prepare for it. Now they just don't want to drive, right? In a hurricane, some people, if you experience many of them because you live in Florida, you're better prepared. So the conclusion to the research was, we don't really know if having firsthand experience, it depends, what that firsthand experience is. So how do you have firsthand experience with UFOs? Well, unless you're somebody special who can call them down and have an experience at will, most people have no firsthand experience and therefore no familiarity with the hazard. All right. So can we build resilience by becoming familiar with it in another way? So here we have somebody stretching before doing a workout. Well, just like your muscles, if we're going to have a big exercise workout and you don't take a light jog or warm them up, you could have a snap, right? That you could tear a tendon or ligament. And people are it turns out, are kind of the same way, right? We talk about being mentally prepared for a big change. So if you're going to have a baby, you're going to get married, psychologists are like, well, you need to mentally prepare for the changes that are going to take place. So you don't have a psychological snap, I guess you could say. I shouldn't compare that to marriage. I never had a psychological snap. All right. Well, cool little study. Happened not too long ago. Found that watching horror movies did prepare people with greater psychological resilience during the pandemic. So if you liked movies about the pandemic and horror, they found those people actually did better during COVID. So did people who like prepper movies, like zombie movies. They found they actually prepared better and were better off. So I don't know. Can you do that? Well, what happened during Close Encounters, right? When Steven Spielberg proposed to NASA that they help him in the filming of it, they wrote him a 20-page letter. And they said, please don't make this movie. People are going to panic. Don't do it. Don't do it. They knew the power of Hollywood because of what happened with Jaws. And now, that was like a year or two before, and people didn't want to go in the water in the ocean. So they wrote an angry letter, according to Spielberg, don't make this movie. Well, it didn't cause mass panic. There was a lot of sightings reported in the next couple summers, but so does having a firsthand experience with an RCE, rowdy compromising event, actually help? We don't know. Okay. So I want to get to, yep, we're almost rounding up here. I do want to read you something, just 1 minute here. There was some talk about religion. Okay, there have been surveys done. Will religion survive or not? The few studies looked at actual denominations, and they talked to the pastors and the followers, but these are opinion surveys. I'm glad they did them, but what it is basically is asking the pastor, rabbi, or whoever, do you think your religion will be okay with it? If ET contact is disclosed, how do you think your religion will survive? How do you think your followers will handle it? Overwhelmingly, all of them seem to indicate, yeah, we'll be fine. our doctrine can make, take the information and incorporate it. It's not against our doctrine. We'll be okay. There was another study done regarding how religious people are and whether they believe the possibility of ET existence. And that one, the people who are very, very religious, apparently, and I think this was just done with Christian faiths, but the more religious they were, the less likely they were to believe in ET existence. But the atheists and those who didn't identify with religion, when they were asked in a different study whether they would be okay with it, they said, oh, yep, because they're up in 80%. 80 percentile said they're okay. And they believe in it, right? But they believed that the religious people would be the ones to struggle with it, and that they would have religious breakdowns and institutional decline. So bottom line, it depends on who you ask. Religious people think they're going to be okay. Non-religious people think religious people won't be okay. Their opinions. All right. So in our use, I don't think this is entirely applicable. We really need to know and see a real life event happen, but we need to try and predict before that by getting useful information. So findings suggest that there are gaps in our understanding, of human reaction to psychologically based events, because they failed to calculate the totality of the influence of these factors that I've named. I think we need more scholarly discourse, if only because scientific discoveries are increasing rapidly. The probability, that ET life will be discovered. And I do think in that we can also look at studies where we look at the process by which the reality compromising event transforms the psyche. So what I mean is, take for example, how individual belief systems are created. And I created kind of another word here called a contra reality. Basically, if somebody, let's take flat earthers, for example. If you really believe that the earth is flat and that's your thing, what happens if one day you're provided with inarguable, like there's so much evidence. Well, this is a bad example because honestly, I mean, how much evidence is there the earth is round? Let's take a different example. There are people who believe 9/11 didn't happen at all. There are people who believe that the buildings were blown up, that planes didn't actually crash into them. Let's just take the plane part, If you present someone with overwhelming convincing information, their whole reality is based on that planes did not crash into the building, but then they're shown that they did. How does somebody maintain that belief that they had? The more that people believe in something that becomes a core value, and this is how cults have so much power as well. If you're isolated from every other information that you can get that contradicts your reality, when the reality is shattered, what happens to that person? And so I think we could do more studies on that, because the most vulnerable people who hold a contra reality, if ET existence is disclosed, how are they going to fare? Does that make sense? Because they're going to be our most vulnerable population. I think the majority of people are going to be okay with accepting the fact, but by okay, I mean, they're probably not going to go run and freak out and do the things that were predicted. But remember, we only need a certain threshold, a certain amount of people who do those types of behaviors, and the whole system comes down. So I think I'm clarifying myself enough. Let me wrap up really quick. I want to read to you from just kind of the worst case scenario here. I guess you could call this the Book of Ben, chapter 56. I spent a whole couple of pages just walking through the scenario, and right before I didn't tag what page it was on. I'm sorry. It's 56, I believe. Yeah, here we go. All right, so I don't mean to just kind of harp on the point over and over of the worst thing that could happen, but that's why we study it, right? We study the worst case so that anything lesser, we can deal with. The above scenario representation skews on the side of describing an ET disclosure event with a sudden onset. The kind of event that might take place via White House press conference without forewarning. While longer gradual discovery lasting years is also possible, the sudden onset most assuredly would involve the immediate crash of the stock market and world economies. Employers will find it impossible to refuse their employees' requests to take several days or weeks off to spend at home. Officials will encourage citizens to take time with their loved ones and reflect on the news that was just released. Repeating the aftermath of 9/11, but perhaps not entirely for security reasons, airline travel will come to a halt. Banks will shut their doors. All entertainment theme parks, movie theaters, and professional sports arenas will be closed. Without clear and official directions, with undisputed facts, people out of work and sitting at home will have little resistance to an immediate avalanche of rumors and fear propagation. Like I said, there will be no second guessing whether the news is meant to be taken as a fictional play, as every world leader and risk communicator will be transmitting the disclosure message. Thus begins the internal process of the individual psyche under attack and the reality transformation that follows. I meant to read parts of this earlier. Apologize, I'm repeating myself, but there is a positive. There's a positive outcome to all this. I don't have time to get into it, but I will say this. Mitigation strategies and what we might do to prepare. As I started writing down a list, I looked at it and I was like, oh my gosh, if there is some sort of government plan, which they haven't told us about, I think I'm writing the playbook. I think I'm writing the playbook of what I would do. And that includes how quickly I would tell the people, who I would use as spokespersons. And I started going down the list and it hits on several key things. So I don't know. I don't know if that's what's occurring. We have to ask ourselves, at the end of the day, are we prepared for a full-scale reality compromising crisis? And for now, the answer is still, it depends. So I hope a number of you, 40 people or so, have stayed with me, and I appreciate it. I'm so sorry for the technical problems and everything, but so it is, right? I mean, here we are talking about the future and technology, and as crisis managers, right, we have to be able to adapt. And I had a little bit of crisis earlier, so thanks for staying with me. But stay tuned. I will make this available in some form. I'm looking to publish parts of this. It's obviously much more in depth than what I just went over, but I wouldn't have been so rushed today if it wasn't for the technical problems. But I appreciate everyone taking an interest in this, because it is, in my opinion, going to come to a head in the next couple of years. I don't know if we're going to know, full disclosure, but I do think we're seeing something take place. And I don't think it's something to be afraid of in the sense of a physical annihilation. It's people that worry me, right? It's people, and how we need to prepare ourselves and to help each other, for the next transformations that take place. So with that, I've got to get out of here. So thank you so much. I don't know if I have the ability. I'm going to edit the first part of that out and all the problems, but we'll chat with you later. Thanks, everybody.